Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Menbet. We're going to get started at the top of our daf. Hamafkid ma'ot etzel chavero. So today we're going to talk about responsibility when it comes to a shomer. Okay, that's really in general our topic. And what I'm supposed to do with the item. You give me money. How am I supposed to protect this item? What does it mean that I've done watching like I've done this the way I'm supposed to? This, by the way, reminds us of the sugya in Bava Kama about when you have an animal that's, let's say, a shor mu'ad or a shor tam, did you protect it like you should have, right? And we talked about things like that. What means I took care of my animal that I shouldn't be responsible, or in what case am I actually responsible? So you'll see similar language in it's part of this Mishnah. Case one, you give me money and I put it in a backpack, right, behind me. We all know that when you go on vacation, especially, or you go into a busy marketplace, everybody says, don't put your wallet in your backpack, right? It's a very easy place for someone to steal it. Even though it's pretty obvious, the Gemara is going to say, I don't understand what's wrong with that, but we'll get to that soon. Okay, it's hard to even read this because there's two different readings. So I read it one way, which is that this is all one case. You gave it to your minor children and you locked the door, but not so well, meaning I guess someone could easily unlock that door. Or these are two totally different cases. You just gave it to your minor children, period. That's case two. Case three is Na'al b'fnehem, right before, Na'al b'fnehem was you lock the door with the children in the house, right? So that it was somewhat protected. Here, Na'al b'fnehem means you lock the door of the house with the money inside. As you weren't home, you locked, right? And the kids weren't home. This has nothing to do with kids. This is just locking them away like in a bad safe, let's say. You have a safe, but it's a safe that could easily be picked, I guess, something like that. Or you locked the door of your house not very well and left the money in your house. In all these cases, chayav. So again, it depends whether you read v'na'al as or and, okay? Meaning either it's connected to the previous or not. The relevance is, let's say, if you say, Masar lebano b'toach tanim, period. If you gave it to your minor children, that means if you gave it to your older children, it's fine. Now, by the way, we learned this before, that, and we'll see it later in today's daf as well, that there's an assumption, remember, shomer shemasar l'shomer, if you're watching it, you can't give it to someone else to watch, but you can't give it to your family members because the person who gave it to you assumes that you're not going to stay 24/7 by this item, but you might actually pass it on to some relative to watch when you leave the house. So that would mean, yes, you could give it to relatives, but not if they're minors. But if you read it as b'no b'toach tanim and lock the door, but not in the best way, then that seems to say, well, leaving it with your children and locking the door properly would be okay. It's just that you didn't lock the door properly, and that's the issue. And there's not much to learn here about whether they're older or not. Shelo shimer kederach hashomrim. Okay, this is the reason. The reason why you're obligated is because you didn't watch over things properly. Now, by the way, it doesn't really specify what kind of shomer we're talking about here. And if you open, for example, the kahati, okay, so I'm just going to hear. Oh, if you open the Mishnah there, so kahati reads, okay. Basically, we already explained, he says that, just paraphrasing, a shomer chinam is not liable for gneva and avida. Okay, right? You're not liable if somebody steals it. Ela im kein pasha b'shmirato, unless you did something wrong in your shmira. And this basically is trying to tell you, a shomer chinam will be responsible for theft if they didn't watch it properly. Okay, so we're talking about a shomer chinam. But Tosfot says, it's on something Shmuel says on the Gemara, but it doesn't really matter. The first Tosfot on the daf says, Sarich iyun, I'm just reading from after the first Dibor Matchil. Im shamrein b'karka v'niknevu misham. If you did do it the way you're supposed to, which we're going to see later, Shmuel says is burying it in the ground, im shomer sachar chayav. He says, perhaps we're even trying to say, okay, what Kahati was focused on when he explained the Mishnah was that if you're a shomer chinam and you generally can just say, oh, it was stolen, and you take an oath, you're fine. That's only if you watched it properly. If you didn't watch it properly, you're going to be liable. But Tosfot focuses on the other direction, which is, what if it's a shomer sachar who did everything he was supposed to do? Okay, we're going to see Shmuel's going to say in the Gemara that you actually have to bury it in the ground. So let's say you buried it in the ground and it was still stolen. If you're a shomer sachar and you got paid for this, and generally if it got stolen, you'd have to pay, you wouldn't actually have to pay. Okay, that's what, or Tosfot says, Sarich, we need to look into this. This, by the way, is the topic of Gefet this week, which should go up later today, which is about this long Tosfot and this big question about, is a shomer sachar exempt from theft if they did everything they were supposed to? Okay, so there's a bit of lack of clarity, right? The Mishnah doesn't specify which case we're talking about, which is very important, whether it's a shomer chinam or a shomer sachar. So anyway, it's a side point. We're going to focus on the simple reading, and we can just maybe say that we're talking about a shomer chinam, but it's not so clear cut. Because it could be a shomer sachar is chayav in gneva v'aveda, but not if you did everything you were supposed to do. So now we have the end of the Mishnah, which is v'im shimer kederach hashomrim patur. Now they don't exactly tell you what the derech hashomrim is, right? But it's obviously whatever it doesn't say in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, you put it behind you, so you didn't put it behind you, you were holding it in your hand. You gave it to your minor children, you gave it to your older children. You didn't lock the door properly, you locked the door properly. Or Shmuel is going to say you buried it in the ground. Okay, so then you'll already be exempt. And again, does that mean shomer chinam or even shomer sachar? So now the Gemara says, Bishlam akulu, shalosh shomer kederach hashomrim. Okay, the latter cases in the Mishnah we get what that means, right? You didn't do a good job. That wasn't a good job. But what else? How else are you going to carry, right? Where else would you put your wallet if not in your backpack? They take a pasuk totally out of context. What's this pasuk? It's talking about when you bring the second tithe, the Maser Sheni. You bring it to Jerusalem. What do? Remember, you don't bring your fruits usually. You redeem them onto coins, and you bring the coins to Jerusalem. But in the Torah's description of bringing the coins to Jerusalem, it doesn't just say bring them to Jerusalem. It says v'natata b'kesef. You should turn it into money. V'tzarta hakesef biyadecha. Put it in a bundle in your hand. And then, okay, and then go to Jerusalem. So now they say, why does it have to tell you this? Even though they're already bundled up, that's not enough. You also have to put them in your hands. And from here we learn how to be responsible about money when you're carrying it. You should put it in your hands. So obviously, if you're taking someone else's money, right now it's there, you're taking second tithe money, Maser Sheni, it's very important to deal with it properly. First of all, if somebody steals it, right, they won't treat it with the proper sanctity, and you have a responsibility to take it and spend it in Jerusalem. You won't be able to do that if somebody steals it. So likewise here, if you have someone else's money, you have to make sure to handle it properly. So package it up, put it in your hands. That's how we deal with it. Now, since we got onto this pasuk, we're going to get off on a tangent, and we're going to have financial advice from Rabbi Yitzchak. So the first financial advice he's going to give comes from this pasuk. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Lo'olam yehei kaspo shel adam matzoi biyado, shene'amar v'tzarta kesef biyadecha. Obviously, really taking this out of context, this means you should always have money in hand, okay? You should always have cash on hand. What does this mean? Different interpretations. It could mean you should always have cash because you never know what will come up that you might want to buy. So make sure you have money. Right nowadays, you don't really need cash anymore, Bid, Zelle, all those other things. But in those days, important to have cash. Perhaps it means you should have liquid assets, right? You shouldn't invest all your money because maybe some business deal will come up and you want to invest in it and your money will all be, stuck somewhere else. And that sort of relates to the next thing he's going to say, which is Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Le'olam yashlish adam et ma'otav. You should split your money in three. Shlish bekarka, a third in land, which many people assume means real estate. Shlish beperk, some people think it means actually buried in the ground, okay? Like what we're going to see soon. And maybe it doesn't mean invested, but hidden deep in the ground so that nobody steals it, right? In those days without banks. Shlish bepragmatia, third in investments. Okay, so you could say in land investments and in business investments, right? Like business ventures. Or you could say, again, a third buried, keep it for safekeeping, a third in investments, which could include real estate or other things, ushlish tachat yado, and then a third easily accessible. Okay, so to say bekarka is buried in biyado in your hand, I don't know. Once it's buried, it's not so hard to access, which might make more sense. That it really means real estate, business ventures, and a third in your hand. And again, remember, this was in the days where they didn't have banks. But Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, right? It's always interesting. I mean, it goes without saying that the rabbis talked about these things as well, right? They give you health advice, they give you, right? Medical, what's good to eat. They give you medical advice, how to deal with certain diseases. They give you advice about finances. Okay, already we're going to have another statement here of his. This is a little bit different. This means blessing will come to something that is hidden. Okay, what he's basically trying to say, and we'll see this a little more in detail in the next statement, which is another statement just like it, which is that don't try to flaunt all your wealth because it brings, jealousy from other people, and that causes what we call ayin hara, right? The people will look badly on your stuff, and might cause you to lose it. So it's funny. I was reading a book to my daughter last night, and in the book, the girl was saying, I had a father who was a pilot. He was killed, and I used to brag about him all the time. And then the kids said it was all my fault that he got killed in an accident because, I brought it upon myself. It was exactly this topic. This idea that people have this superstitious, or I don't know, superstitious, but a belief that if you cause too much attention, then people will be jealous of you, and that will actually cause you to lose the item. And then basically the point is that if you hide things and which again connects with the Mishnah about hiding, even though it's a totally different context, but that's where you'll get bracha. And where do we get this from? Shnemal, Yitzav Hashem itcha et habracha b'asamecha. This is the pasuk at the end of Sefer Dvarim when there's the blessings and the curses. It says God will give you the bracha in your asamecha. Asamecha are your storage houses, but the root asam has the word samoy in it. Samoy is hidden. Okay, so the bracha will come in the hidden places. And here's the Tana de Rabbi Ishmael, where they talk about the ayin hara. Ein bracha mitzuya ele b'davar she'ein ha'ayin sholetet bo. You will only have a bracha in a place where people can't see it. Shenemar yitzav Hashem itcha et habracha b'asamecha, right? Which basically means don't flaunt it. Okay, it's not good because, place where the eye can't see. That's why it means ayin hara, because people will look on it and then they'll say, oh, look, that person has everything. Kind of like Eov, right? And then it might cause you to lose what you have. And again, this Braita just basically supports Rabbi Yitzchak, says kind of the same thing in different words, and they learn it from the same pasuk. Now we're going to have a different drasha we're going to learn from that pasuk, totally different. We're getting off on a lot of tangents here. Tanu Rabbanan, haolech lamod et garno. You're going to go measure what's in your granary, how much crop you had this year. Omer, you go and you say a bracha before you get there. Now, even though it's already in there, not much is going to happen to it, but you can still say a bracha, like a request to God. You hear it some fanecha, Hashem Lokenu, right? May it be the will of God. Shetishlach bracha b'masei yadenu, that you will give a bracha to my produce. Okay, because maybe something could happen. Why? Because we're going to get to, well, it's not, you didn't see it yet, you didn't count it yet, you didn't measure it yet, so you never know. Anything could happen. A miracle could happen still. Hitchila mode, once you start measuring and you would say, okay, it's too late at this point because I'm already sitting there with the pile of measuring what possibly could happen, still not. You could still make a bracha, although notice the language is a little different. One could claim maybe this is a little bit of a different kind of bracha. Baruch hasholech bracha b'kriyaseh. Blessed is the person who sends a blessing to this pile. So it's a little different, and you could almost call this, possibly even call this a bracha of thanks. Okay, because you're thanking God. You're saying God is the God who brings blessings to this pile. But you're sort of asking, and you'll see why, because in a minute, you're not going to be allowed to say this anymore at a later stage. So if it's really just thanking, you can always thank. So we're going to see this. This is obviously viewed as a somewhat of a request, even though it's not a complete request. But madad shav. But once you already measured and you know exactly how much there is, then you can't make any sort of bracha because that's a wasted blessing. That's a wasted prayer. Okay, this is like they say, right? I'll give you an example. When I was younger, I always used to think about this, right? Can you pray for help with, doing well on a test, right? When you're a kid, like that was the big deal. I want to succeed on my test. So, when can you pray for that? Well, before the test, of course, you could pray. Once you take the test, is it too late, right? Not exactly, because it all depends on how the teacher grades the exam. Once the teacher grades the exam, though, you might not have seen it, but once it's graded, it's graded. There's not much you could do, although one could claim still you could appeal it. But anyway, so that's to pray at that point is useless because it's already a done deal. Now they say, this comes from that pasuk we just read, the bracha is not found lo b'davar shakul, not in something weighed, lo b'davar madud, not in something measured, but lo b'davar manoy, not in anything that was counted. Once it's counted, weighed, measured, you know exactly how much there is. nothing's going to change. You're not going to be able to have a bracha, right? A bracha happens only in things that you can't see. Okay, so this is a different kind of thing than the ayin hara issue. This is just don't pray for something once it's already counted, measured, weighed. Nothing's going to change. But until that point, you never know. A miracle could happen, and it could double in size. It could, anything could happen, and therefore you can't pray. Again, bracha is in your asam and something you can't see. Once it's already measured, you won't be able to notice it. That was a total tangent. We got off on why we get there because we were talking about the money and holding it in your hand, and then we proved from the pasuk about maaser sheni. From that pasuk, we got to how you're supposed to have money at all times, cash on hand. It's good for, business opportunities, other things. From there, we got into financial advice. And because we use that pasuk for the financial advice, we got into other things about money that we learned from there. Amar Shmuel. Ksafim ein lahem shmira ela b'karka. Now comes Shmuel and says the only way to properly protect things is by burying it in the ground. Okay, question is he talking only about money? Is he talking about other things as well? Perhaps just money? And is he trying to explain the Mishnah? Or is he saying in the Mishnah time, you could lock your door properly, but already in the time of the Gemara and in Babylonia where I live, things are different. Okay, so there's a big debate about whether Shmuel actually is discussing and explaining the Mishnah, that when it says the only way to do it is kiderach hashomrim, and that means buried in the ground. Or is Shmuel just kind of saying, okay, nowadays, this is the best way to do it. Okay, and there are in fact commentaries that say, nowadays we do what is relevant for now, like put it in a safe. Okay, because we're going to see now that historically things changed. So now we're going to read right now how that happened. So first, before we get to other changes that went about and what the best place to hide money in different time periods was, again, totally relevant nowadays. Now, either put it in the bank or put it in, even though people might say even the bank isn't safe, right? But put it in a safe, put it in whatever it might be. But obviously, they're burying it in the ground is not really the relevant method these days. Amarava. Well, the only time you don't have to bury it in the ground is if somebody gives you the money just before Shabbos. So we don't expect you to spend the time burying it in the ground when you have to make Shabbos. So at what point do you become liable? If it gets stolen from your house, if it gets stolen that Shabbat, you did what you were supposed to do. What more were you expected to do? But if you waited the amount of time after Shabbat ended that you could have buried it and you didn't bury it and then it got stolen, you'd already be liable. But here's a weird exception. If you're a Talmid Chacham, you get extra time. Why do you get extra time? Because you might need the money for Havdalah. Okay, what? Only Talmidei Chachamim make Havdalah, not everybody else. So some people explain maybe the Talmidei Chachamim don't want to hear Havdalah from someone else. So they might need the money to go buy themselves wine to be able to make Havdalah for themselves. Okay, maybe that's it. It's a bit of a strange statement, what exactly it comes from and what the issue is. It's right. And then exactly what Tina's asking, which is, who says he could use the money? It's someone else's money. How can he use it, right? So either he was planning to use it and immediately replace it. It's money, it's not like a vessel he's watching. Anyway, it's a very confusing statement here, and what exactly is going on is not so clear. You can look at Rashi, Mitzvah Rabbanan who hamafkid. Okay, here they say, Rashi explains it that the one who gave you the money is a Talmid Chacham. Shu chared al mitzvat havdalah lakos. Okay, and then he didn't bury it because maybe the guy will come looking for his own money. That's another interpretation. So it was a bit of a baffling line that, caused all sorts of different interpretations. But here goes back to our main topic. But nowadays, and this is the Gemara talking in their time, now that there's all these people who go into people's houses and check the ground because they know that this is the problem. Once that's where everybody puts their stuff, then everybody knows to look there. So now that there's people who go through the ground and the dirt in people's houses, you have to put it on top of the beams or somewhere, hide it in the beams of your ceiling. But then people got wind of that and people started checking the beams. So you have to put it in between the walls. Okay, what are in between what walls? So there were apparently inner walls and outer walls to houses. And in between, they would put cement keep them together. So people would hide things in between there. That was a good spot to hide. Amarava umod Shmuel bekotel. And they say Shmuel would agree that if you put it in the wall. Okay, if you remember, we talked a lot about people hiding things in the wall. Remember, we said you go in your house and you find things that are old, right? You can assume it's from the time of the Amori people, and people would hide things in the wall itself. So then they say, but now there's people who basically knock on your wall. And if they hear it's hollow, then they know that there's going to be money in there because it means it's hollow space. If it doesn't make a noise, right, that kind of, you can hear the noise when it's hollow, it doesn't make that noise, and they'll leave your wall alone. So basically, people figure out where your money is. But if you hide it in your wall and the part that's right near the ground or the part that's right near the ceiling, you won't hear that hollow sound when you knock. That's the only place where you can really hide the money now. Okay, so you see how this went through different changes over time in terms of what's safe and what's not safe, which is what led some of the commentaries to say this is not a halacha that you have to take as, oh, right nowadays we have to hide things in our walls, right? Nobody does that. You have to pick the best way it is in your time. Now we want to know, okay, we're going to get a little off topic, but we're going to bring it right back, which is, and we'll get to Pesach, which is nice, which is how deep in the ground you need to bury it according to Shmuel. It says in the Mishnah, if you have chametz and on it falls like an avalanche type thing, a bunch of stones fall on top of it and it's buried, that's already as if you got rid of your chametz because it's buried under a pile of rubble. Rashbag seems to be explaining Tanakama and says it's only though if a dog can't get there. If a dog can get underneath that pile of rubble and get to the food, well, that doesn't help you. That's not destroyed before Pesach, because if the dog can go in and take it, right, then you might have chametz in your house because the dog will go. Vitana kama chapisat kelev, and then they ask, well, how deep does it have to be buried for a dog to be able to not get there anymore? Shloshat tvachim. They say 3 tvachim, which is our magic number, right? When it comes to levud on with the sukkah close to the ground, right? Anything in Shabbat, when it comes to, we talked about domains and all that, anything within 3 tvachim of the ground is like it's on the ground. So anyway, we say shloshat tvachim. Hachamai. What about here? Is that the same thing? Is it the same 3 tvachim measurement that when you say buried in the ground, it has to be deep down 3 tvachim? Maybe in on shloshat tvachim alone. Do you need that? Amarle, no. What's the issue with the dog? The dog can smell it. So you have to make sure he can sniff it out. 3 tvachim under the ground, already the dog can't sniff it out. But here we just want it to be hidden from the eye. So you don't need 3 tvachim for people not to see it. So if so, v'kama, how much? Amara from Isichra, tefach. It has to be a tefach under the ground. That's enough. Now we're going to start from here till the end of the daf, which is going to end at the next Mishnah. We're going to talk about stories and cases. And these are fun cases because it's all about things that you can imagine happening on a regular basis. And in fact, we're going to get to, the first case is not this, but later we're going to get to this one blames that one, this one blames that one. And ultimately, sometimes there's no one to blame. And this goes on all the time, not just with watching items, but with all sorts of, you have a worker in your house who says, oh, that was the problem of the guy before me, and I didn't do that. And, or there's 2 companies and, each one, oh, well, you did something with, whatever. It happens all the time. Everyone's just blaming somebody else. And then you don't even know where, right, nobody ultimately is responsible. And as you know, so to get someone to pay, you kind of need proof. So we're going to see all sorts of situations, and we're going to get into situations where somebody might have been watching something but didn't give all the information to the other person, and then the other person was under a misimpression. And whose fault was that? Should he have provided all the information? Because didn't provide all the information that caused the miscommunication. We're going to get into all sorts of interesting cases. So first case is so you give me money to watch. Okay, and these are actual cases. So somebody gave someone something to watch, money, and he put it in a hut made of willow branches, like from Sukkot, a ravot. Ignuv, and it was stolen from there. Now, you might think a willow branch house doesn't sound like much. Well, we're going to see it's actually protected from thieves. Why is it protected from thieves? because nobody thinks that you have money in a willow hut. If you live in a willow hut, you're most likely not very wealthy, and therefore, what kind of money would you have to hide? So it's really protected from thieves, actually. It's like a fuch halafuch, right? Best place is like the place where you would least likely expect it. But it's not protected from fire, which is going to put this in the category of something we've seen before. And if you haven't listened to Alana Steinhain's shiur from last week, Din and Daf, you should listen because it's all about this topic of tchilato b'pshi'a v'safo ba'ones. You put it in a place where it wasn't really responsible because it could have gone on fire. So because of that, it's not so responsible. I guess fires were prevalent. But in the end, it wasn't the fire that caused it to be destroyed. It was that someone came and stole it. But it was protected from that. That's what we call tchilato b'pshi'a. Your first act was a bad act. You should put it in a place that wasn't protected from fire. But in the end, what happened was ones, unexpected, because who's going to steal from a willow hut? So Amar Rav Yosef, even though when it comes to thieves, it was actually protected. Le'inyan nura, when it comes to fire, pshiuta, you were negligent. Therefore, and therefore falls into this category of tchilato b'pshi'a. You started off doing the wrong thing, but in the end, it was ones that happened, and you're liable. But ikad amre, you might remember this is a whole machloket. Are you chayav or patur in this kind of case? So some people say, even though you were wrong because for putting it there in the first place, because it could have been a fire, but in the end, but it was protected when it came to thieves and tchilato b'pshi'a v'safo ba'ones patur. Here's the other side, which is, oh, well, in the end, it was safo ba'ones, and you're actually exempt. The hilchata, but the halacha is tchilato b'pshi'a v'safo ba'ones chayav, and therefore this person should be obligated. Okay, so this seems to be an add-on that the Gemara is telling you. By the way, the halacha is this. Okay, there were two versions of what this person was told, but the halacha is in fact that you be liable. Ha'u gaver de'afkid zuzay gabe chavre amar li havli zuzay. This, I believe we saw this before. But anyway, where do we see this? On Lamed Hay, also the same case. Somebody gave money, okay, you gave me money to watch. Amarle havli zuzai, you come back asking for your money. Amarle lo yadana hechot v'inu. I say, I don't know where I put it. Ata the kamei to Rava, they go before Rava. Amarle kol lo yadana pshiyute zil shalem. Said to me, if you say you don't know where you put it, that is pshi'ah. Okay, that is total negligence. Well, what do you mean you don't know where you put it? And you have to pay. So this obviously raises the question, I think we discussed this last time we had it, which is, well, what is Aveda then? Isn't this Aveda, loss, right? I say it's lost. If I'm a shomer chinam, I'm not liable if I say it's lost. So what do you mean? Well, saying I don't know where I put it, is that not Aveda? So again, you could explain the difference, which is not knowing where I put something. If I'm a shomer, I'm watching your item. My main responsibility is to know where I'm putting it. That's not losing something. Okay. And losing something, by the way, means all sorts of things. Losing something could be, I put it here and it's not there anymore. Okay. So that would be this, right? Here, I don't even know where I put it. So that's not losing. Losing would be, I know where I put it and it's not there. Or losing could be, I did something that made it get lost, or something like that, where it was somewhat my fault. So again, this just raises the discussion. What does it mean, Aveda? Okay, what exactly does that mean? You gave me money to watch and I give it to my mother. Now, I didn't tell my mother that it was someone else's. And that's going to be a question here. So she puts it in a box. She didn't bury it in the ground. Now, if it was someone else's item, according to what we learned, you have to bury it in the ground. So she didn't bury it in the ground. And what happens? She puts it in a box, and it's stolen. Amarava, how are the judges going to rule in this case? So he starts giving out the possibilities, because now we have two different people who are potentially responsible, but neither one, right? I didn't put it in the box. I gave it to someone else. They should have been responsible and buried it, but I didn't tell them they were supposed to bury it. So it becomes one of those who's responsible. So if we say to me, the shomer, the one who was given the responsibility in the first place, Amar, turning now to Amabet, I didn't do anything wrong. I gave it to my mother to watch. And we learned, even if a shomer, shemasar the shomer is chayav, right? I can't just give it to somebody else to watch, because you could say, I didn't want my pikadon in the hands of that person. But anyone who gives something to me knows I'm going to give it to my wife or to my sons or to my husband in my case. And even to my mother. Okay. In other words, it didn't say mother here, but the obvious point is that you give it to a family member because I'm not going to stand there 24/7 watching it. So therefore, I didn't do anything wrong by giving it to her, even though I didn't tell her, which we'll get to, that it was an item I was watching. Let's say to the mother, you pay. Amra lo amrali delav dideni nudak berinu. Right? My son or my daughter didn't tell me that it wasn't theirs, that I needed to bury it. I didn't have all the information. Like this, by the way, goes on in my house all the time, right? That you don't give, if you often, okay, I know in my house, right, as the mother of the house, or, often you have all the information about everything in the house. And you don't always remember to tell everybody every little thing about, oh, why didn't you tell me you were saving this for that? Or why didn't you tell, right? It's impossible to tell everybody everything. So basically, I forgot to tell my mother that it was someone else's. Or maybe I intentionally didn't tell her it was someone else's, and we'll see why. So she can claim, well, I didn't know it was someone else's. I didn't know I was supposed to bury it. I didn't do anything wrong. So name so now go back to me. Amai lo amarla. Why don't you tell your mother? Amal, I could have a good excuse for that. What is that? Okay, think about a relationship of a mother to a child. If I told my mother it was mine, all the more so she watch it. What does she care if it's someone else's? She doesn't care so much about other people's stuff, but mothers and their children's stuff, right? She won't want me to lose my money. She'll take the best care possible if she thinks it's mine. So basically, I'm not responsible. The mother's not responsible. What are we going to do? Ella amarava. So how do we do this? So I have to take the oath that I gave it to my mother to watch, which is okay. I was allowed to do that. And then the mother could say, look, I did what I thought was the responsible thing. I put them in a box and she'll be exempt. So here you have a case where nobody's going to be responsible. The next case is going to be a little more complicated, and perhaps we will be able to put a finger on someone in the end, or perhaps even come up with some compromise. All depends on which Rishon you are and how you understand the Gemara. Okay, I'll already preface it with, there's a huge debate about the conclusion of this sugya, about whether it's just a compromise agreement or whether it's a law, this is the case. So, which obviously is going to have ramifications on other cases, right? Whether you say it's just a compromise or whether you say it's law. The whole concept of compromise in the Gemara is very interesting. It comes up, we'll see it throughout the Bavas, about sometimes where the halacha is a compromise, which is just an interesting concept that, right, this exists. It's kind of like lifnim mishurat hadin, or, right, sometimes there's the letter of the law, and then sometimes you need to use compromise. So Rashi is going to say this is a compromise case, but not everybody agrees with him. So, we had orphans, and then we had a steward that was in charge of their money, apitropos. Zavin lehu Torah liyatme umasre lebakara. He bought an ox for the children with their money and gave it to a cowherd. Okay, someone who has a herd of these oxen and he's taking care of them. Okay, so far sounds all good. So he's basically a shomer now for the orphans' ox. Lo havale kache b'shine lemecha. The issue is, though, this shore didn't have teeth and couldn't eat. So when the cowherd put out food for it to eat, didn't eat, umate, and he died. Now the question is, who's responsible for the fact that the ox died? And who knew he didn't have teeth? It seems like nobody really knew he didn't have teeth. And we're going to see, did the seller know he didn't have teeth? Did the buyer, right, when the steward bought it, did he check that the animal had teeth? And did he tell the bakar that it didn't have teeth, right? In other words, there was misinformation going on here and issues. So Amarami Barhama. Okay. Amarami Barhama. So he says, how are we going to rule in this case? If we say to the steward, it's your fault. Amar, ana lebakar masarte. What do you mean? I did what I was supposed to do. I was responsible. I gave it to a responsible person, right? Probably paid him also. He seems to be a hired bakar. And I did exactly what I was supposed to do. So let's go look at the bakar, the cowherd. Amar lei, ana bahade tarukim. I did what I was supposed to do. I put him with all the rest of my oxen. I put food out in front of them. Lo aviyadina de lo achal. I didn't look to see if he ate. In other words, I just assume I put food in front of animals. I don't have to check that they eat their food. It's not like kids, you have to make sure your kids eat your food. They might not eat if the mothers don't bother them to eat, or the grandmothers, or whatever it might be. But animals, they always eat. So what? I didn't even think that the animal wasn't going to eat. So michti bakara shomer sachar diyatme. So basically, it sounds like nobody's responsible. So now they say, wait a minute, isn't the bakar, like I said before, shomer sachar diyatme? He's getting paid for this job. So doesn't that put him in a level that we're going to expect more from him? He should have looked. What's his job if not to make sure the animals are being fed properly? It sounds like it really should be his fault, and he should pay the orphans and compensate them for their loss. To which they say, well, really, if this was a loss for the orphans, of course, yes, he would in the end have to pay because he was a shomer sachar. But what? This must have been a case. Now, this is trying to figure out what's the deliberation. It's obvious. If they lost their animal and now have 0, and they had an animal worth 200 zuz, let's say, of course, they're going to get their money back from the bakar because the bakar got paid for this job. But we're talking about when there's no loss for them. How could there possibly be no loss? Well, de Torah, ushkol yat mezuze mine. Well, what happened was the steward went back to the person who they bought it from and said, give me my money back. So the orphans actually lost nothing because they say to the guy, would you sell me an animal that has no teeth, that can't eat, that's not going to survive? So they got their money back. So basically, that's why neither of them is responsible. But then they say, so what was Rami Barhama's deliberation then? Elamai Katain, who was claiming anything then? What was the issue that he was grappling with? So they say, Mari de Torah Katain, it's the seller. And that the seller lost their animal now, sold the animal that didn't have teeth, and now got back, right? They had to give the money back, and they have no animal to show for it. So they're the ones who come and claim, oh, Apitropos, you bought the animal and then gave it to someone who wasn't responsible, and the person wasn't responsible. Which one am I going to be able to get some money back from? In other words, what's he going to say? You should have told me that the animal had no teeth. Now, at that point, by the way, what could he have done? He could have taken the animal back and slaughtered it. In other words, you let that animal die. Once the animal dies, you can't slaughter it anymore. It's a dead animal. It has nothing to do with a dead animal, right? You could maybe sell it for a little bit of money, but it's not, you can't slaughter it and eat it. So he could tell them, you should have told me the animal had no teeth and come back to me, and then at least I would have had an animal I could have slaughtered. So my modina, what do you mean they should have told him? He sold them the animal. Did he not know? It was his responsibility to know that the animal had no teeth. To which they say, which is very interesting, bisafsira, he was a middleman. And the middleman buys and sells on the same day. It doesn't always look at all, it doesn't open the mouth of the animal to see, do you have no teeth? Okay, and I guess it was also pretty uncommon, I would imagine, for an animal not to have teeth, for him to have to have worried about it. So basically, it's interesting that they're saying he's not really responsible, or at least not fully responsible, to have checked, right? When you're a middleman, do you have to always check what you buy, make sure it's good before you pass it on to someone else? So the assumption is the middleman had no idea because he bought it and immediately sold it. Then we basically say, so he buys it, sells it on that day, didn't notice, gives it off, and says to them, you should have noticed and given it back to me. So what do we do? In other words, now we have 3 people who, maybe he's right. So now they say, what do we do? First, the middleman has to say, I swear I didn't know. Okay, because maybe he's lying and just trying to get some money out of them. So if he takes an oath that he really didn't know, in the end, we do put the responsibility on the bakar, but only partial responsibility. They have to pay what the meat would have gone for cheap, meaning if the original guy had gotten it back with the animal, with its no teeth, but would have been able to slaughter it, what it would have cost, like 2/3 the price of what it would have cost if he had slaughtered it and sold it. Okay, now why 2/3? So here comes the Rashi that says it's a pshara. Okay, it's a very long Rashi. Mishalim bakara demei basar bezol. First of all, he asks a question, which is, I don't get why Rami, the first question he asked is a different question, but let's read it anyway. Tamani minayin l'Rami bar Hamadin zeh. Where does he get this from? Malo l'safsi ra'im roa lo shomer shalohu. The roa is not his shomer, right? In other words, the roa was the shomer of the apitropos. How does he go? They had no connection, those two people, right? He was the middleman that sold it to the apitropos, and the apitropos gave it to this bakar. So they say based on Rabbi Yossi. Remember Rabbi Yossi, shomer, right? The shomer, the socher that gives it to the shoel, right? So that's the whole thing about, you can say, right, what does he have to do with him? Well, he said if someone passed on to someone else, they ultimately, right, the connection is between the two of them, and that works. So that's a side point. But then if you look much further down in Rashi, about at least more than halfway down that Rashi, Umiyu ihave mafside yatomim lo haya osep shara b'mamon yatomim l'shamem b'zol. They say if the yatom couldn't get his money back, the orphan, there's no pshara here. You'd have to pay the full amount. And that's the real issue of Rashi saying this is just a pshara. He says, right, yatme are not b'nei mechila. How does pshara work, compromise? Because everybody gives in a little. Now, yatomim can never give in. So because Rashi views this whole thing as a compromise, he says, if it were the case where the orphans couldn't get their money back, there would be no pshara. You'd have to pay the full amount. Okay? Yeah. Rashi said the 2/3 is a pshara because we don't really know. It's one of those cases. You're not really sure who's responsible, so you make some sort of intermediate agreement here. Tosfot disagrees entirely. It's a very short Tosfot. If you look at Demei Basar B'Zol, he says, Perish Rashi itil pshara b'nehem. Okay, this is a compromise. Rabbanit tam perish dedin gamurhu. This is the law. Because if he would have told him, he would have slaughtered it and sold it cheaply. Okay, or at least sold it cheaply. In other words, the cheap price means you just have to give him the minimum price, like not the highest price you get in the shukfer, but the lowest price you get in the shukfer, because he has to compensate him for the loss. The Baal Or says, why Bizol? He gives a different explanation. He also thinks it's the law. It's not a compromise that you're not going to get the full value, because this animal couldn't eat. So its meat was obviously not as good. So you're going to get only a cheap value of the meat because this animal never would have been worth the full value of the meat because it couldn't eat. So obviously its meat was not as good. So anyway, you have a whole debate here about whether this is a compromise or this is not. And it seems like, again, what would be if the orphans didn't get their money, right? If the orphans couldn't get their money back, then you have to pay the orphans, and then also maybe only basar bezol, or maybe you'd have to pay them back the full amount. Depending on, right? Again, Rashi says it's compromise. Well, there is no such thing as compromise when it comes to orphans. Halu Gavra, next case. De'afki kashuta gabe chavri. He gave hops to his friend to watch. Hops was what they made beer with. So his friend has this pile of hops. And he had his own pile of hops. So there's two piles of hops there. Amalei Sarse, he says to his brewer, Mehai Rami, go take from this pile. Meaning his own pile, right? Go make beer from this pile. Azarami Miida. Well, the Sarse, the brewer, decides to take from the other pile, doesn't listen to him, okay? So again, we're going to have an issue of who's responsible. And he takes and makes beer from the other person's cups. Amrav Amram, how are the judges going to rule here? Because again, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. If we say to the original owner, pay, he said, I did what I was supposed to. I told the guy to pick from this pile. I didn't take him to go to that pile. I didn't tell him to take from there. He didn't tell me take from here and don't take from there. He didn't tell me that was someone else's. This is like the mother. I didn't know I was watching someone else's property. I didn't know that pile was someone else's. You didn't tell me. You didn't give me all the information, right? This is classic in the house, right? I tell someone something. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't think I had to tell them everything. I thought it was pretty obvious. If I say take from here, it meant take from there. It meant don't take from those. Okay, so now they say end, right? So you told me take from there. I thought you were just indicating where I could find hops, but I found them somewhere else. I took them from there. So now they point out a side point, which is if the piles were far away from each other, and I sent the brewer to get the closer pile, and he went to the farther pile, and I could tell that it took him a lot longer, then I should have realized already that there was an issue here, and I should have told him. And that all depends on the circumstances. So if he waited enough time that, to bring it below itile, meaning if it took 2 minutes to get to the closer pile and he didn't come back after 2 minutes, then I must have known that you were going to take the farther pile and I didn't care, and then the responsibility could be on me. But anyway, sof might say the ika. They say, I don't get it though. What's the loss? He made beer with this. I have my pile of hops. Just return him the value of hops. Like I benefited. I can't not pay back if I benefited from the fact that I used his pile of hops to make my beer, right? How come I already used it and I benefited. So we're going to have two possible answers, and with this will end. Could be that the beer went bad. It got sour, like turned to vinegar. And then I have no benefit because it's ruined. So if it got ruined and it was your hops and it wasn't my fault that the hops got taken from your pile and I have no benefit from this and I don't have to reimburse you for anything because in the end, I'm not responsible and my brewer is not responsible. Rav Ashi Amar Bekise, U'Mishalim Lei Demei Kise. Could be there were a lot of thorns in it. And then I would have to pay you the value of a pile of hops with thorns. In other words, the point is here, Tosfot says it well, which is, or actually it quotes Rashi here. Okay, I guess it's in Rashi, but he said, right, that's the last Rashi, that it only benefited the beer a little bit because it had these thorns in it. So the hops helped the beer, but didn't exactly help the beer so much. So I only have to pay you that little amount that it improved, but I don't actually have to pay you the value of the hops themselves. They say, well, what would you have done with those hops if they have thorns? Well, theoretically, you could have pulled out the thorns, Rashi explains, or maybe it's not Rashi, maybe Tosfot explains it, but you could have also, perhaps you could have sold it as animal fodder or something. You could have done something else with them. So they have a certain value, but the value I have to pay is only the value of what I benefited. I don't have to pay you any more than that. Okay, so what we saw today is what level of shmira is expected from me. As I said, you can listen to Gefet this week that'll go up later today about this issue of is the hiding the money in the ground, does that even exempt a shomer sachar or only a shomer chinam, and more in depth about that whole topic. If you didn't listen to Alana Steinhain's shiur last week on tchilato b'ones, you can listen now because this all connects to today's daf about the other case we saw about that with the house of made of willows. So anyway, we started with what your level of responsibility is when it comes to money, what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to protect it. Then from there, we got to some financial advice and on a tangent. Then we got to all these cases, basically, where we talked about things changing and how you have to protect them in different ways and different times, depending on how smart your thieves get. And then we got to all these different cases where either it was tchilato b'ones, for example, or there were multiple people responsible, or you didn't remember where you put it, right? And we had all these different cases of who's to blame, and do we come up with some compromise? Does nobody have to pay in some of the cases? Or do you just have to pay what you benefited? And with that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everybody a good day. And again, a chodesh tov from yesterday, and hoping for besorot tovot.